Welcome to Hawthorn University's webinar series. I'm Paula Bartholomew, and I'm always delighted to be here together with you and to be able to facilitate this special extended presentation, and we'll have time for Q&A. We'll certainly respond to your questions or comments at the end of this presentation, but I encourage you to write them into the webinar question panel at any time so that you're in queue. And yes, sure, the presentation will be recorded and it'll be available for replay on our website in just a few days. Today, we're going to focus on intermittent fasting, addressing current nutritional research and protocols. Intermittent fasting may be the missing link needed to combat our current epidemics of obesity and metabolic syndrome and cancer, from prevention to treatment, and then how to improve overall health and longevity with dietary manipulation. So we're fortunate to have Georgette Schwartz with us today presenting. She's been a nutrition and fitness educator and a specialist focusing on complete mental and physical well-being for over 20 years. And what started as a passionate interest has turned into a dream career for Georgette, who currently serves as Director of Nutrition and Integrative Acupuncture. Through resolving her own health challenges with dietary and lifestyle changes, Georgette became inspired to help others and is a devoted and thorough student and practitioner of the healing arts. She holds her Master's of Science in Holistic Nutrition from Hawthorn University, where her thesis was on the role of the ketogenic diet in the fight against cancer. She's board certified in holistic nutrition, is licensed fitness trainer, and is certified in the following areas: as a metabolic balance coach, as a healthcare practitioner in Metagenics first-line therapy, as a GAPS practitioner, a gluten practitioner, and as a WALS warrior. Georgette also has numerous other professional associations, including International and American Association of Clinical Nutritionists, the National Association of Nutrition Professionals, and is also an active member of the Institute for Functional Medicine. So with that said, it's really a pleasure to have you with us, Georgette.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm excited to be here. So we're going to talk about intermittent fasting tonight. I was lucky enough to present at the NANP annual conference on the same subject, and it got really nice response. So some of you may know the quote, "Anger begets anger and kindness begets kindness." Well, that was said by Mahavira back in the 6th century. He's also said some other very profound things, but I found this one and I thought, wow, we know fasting has been a sort of religious thing for many, many, many years. And one of his quotes was, "Start the practice of self-control with some penance, begin with a fast." And I thought it was just appropriate for tonight's presentation. So the educational objectives are that we can understand the benefits of intermittent fasting versus traditional dieting, implement current intermittent fasting protocols, and identify which clients should consider intermittent fasting, and then use lab work and lab values to determine how our clients are doing. If I say patient during the presentation, you'll forgive me. I'm in a functional medicine office and our clients are patients, and I'm so used to saying patients, so forgive me if that happens. So some of the things that you want to consider as we're going through the presentation is which of my clients will benefit from intermittent fasting, what's the best approach to incorporate intermittent fasting into somebody's lifestyle, and how will I monitor the person using intermittent fasting, because there are so many different ways to do intermittent fasting, and there's a lot of names out there today. We've got time-restricted feeding, we've got fasting mimicking diets, and then we've got intermittent fasting. And they all basically come together at a central point, and that is that we are restricting either the amount of calories and the time that we're eating, or both. And one of the things I like people to think about is we take a break from everything we do in life, hopefully. We sleep from being awake. We take a vacation from working, and rarely do we take a break from eating. And so I think that this is the rest part of our metabolic processes, and you'll find out why it allows the body to do some amazing healing during intermittent fasting. We've all been told breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and I started doing some research on breakfast and how it came about, and it was actually promoted by the grain farmers and the grain lobbyists back in the day, and also the egg and bacon um, lobbyists, because of course bacon was a cured meat, so they didn't need refrigeration, and hens lay their eggs first thing in the morning. Nobody's going out really and slaughtering an animal first thing in the morning and then cooking it up, so eggs were easy. And the grain part, if you can guess, I'm sure you'll know, was started with a healing vegetarian, but also somebody who was involved in the cereal business, aka Kellogg's. And so this became a big, strong lobby, and they convinced the government, the USDA, that breakfast was a critically important meal. And in 2010, we had guidelines on eating breakfast. But when they redid the guidelines in 2015, there was absolutely not one guideline on eating breakfast. So it's nice to know that the powers that be are hopefully paying attention to the fact that we have epidemics of obesity and diabetes and cancer. So why is it bad to eat breakfast? Or why is it wrong to eat breakfast? It prevents the depletion of glycogen. It prevents the body from using fat as energy. It increases our daily load of insulin. And in case you all don't know this, insulin is our fat storage hormone. It leads to eating more calories throughout the day, and it may in fact be the exact opposite of what we thought, but a large contributor to the obesity epidemic. I think all of us can look around and know that there is an obesity epidemic. In 2017, the statistics showed that almost 40% of adults and almost 20% of children aged 2 through 19 were obese, and this is up 35% from 35% and 17% just 4 years ago in 2014. And that's a pretty scary statistic, because with obesity comes so many health-related problems. This is just a map showing you the prevalence of obesity in 2016, and this is self-reported, so who knows what the real numbers look like. You people out on the West Coast have a pretty low incidence of it, lower than some, and Colorado on the map is, of course, one of the lowest. Yay for Colorado. So what are some of the problems associated with obesity? And of course, the risk of dying is increased tremendously. High blood pressure, dyslipidemia, any imbalance in the cholesterol levels, type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, an increase in stroke, gallbladder disease. And then I think some of these things are some things that people don't really think about. Osteoarthritis. And from the inflammation from being obese, it can actually start to break down the cartilage and bone within a joint. Sleep apnea and breathing problems. Obviously, if there's a big fat belly pressing on your throat at night when you're lying down trying to sleep, it's going to impair how you breathe. Among other things. Some cancers. Cancer has a very strong link to obesity. I spent 4 years in an integrative cancer clinic, and the first thing that the physician I worked with would have people do if they were overweight was lose weight, because the propensity for cancer growth was also greater in an overweight or obese person. Low quality of life is a big problem for obese people, mental illness, and then body pain and difficulty with physical functioning, which of course then feeds into it becomes a vicious cycle. You've got somebody obese who's having a hard time moving, and then they become more obese and move less, and it just perpetuates like that. So the estimated healthcare costs that are related to obesity are just astonishing, and they're killing our economy and our healthcare situation, which is bad enough to begin with. But we've got $190.2 billion spent in 2017, up from $147 billion in 2008. That's a pretty scary statistic. And 21% of all of our spending in this country is on costs related to obesity. Some of the things people don't think about if they don't own a business is the effect it has on businesses. There's more sick days, there's higher healthcare insurance premiums, there's a lot of absenteeism, and so this becomes a big, big, big problem. And you can see down at the bottom that absenteeism costs $4.3 billion annually, and that's directly related to obesity. So how did all of this happen? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with lifestyle patterns. We've become a nation of supersize me. And so a portion, people forget that like a half a cup of cooked grain is a portion. And so we're eating way more than we should be. The processed packaged food and fast food becomes a problem. I think Dr. Hyman just recently said, if Mark Hyman, I'm sure you're all familiar with him, said that 73% of all packaged and processed food contains sugar. And of course, the FDA has allowed labeling to disguise sugar in so many ways, so people don't necessarily know what they're eating. And we've become extremely sedentary in front of the computer, and so we're not moving our bodies like we're intended to do. And then there are some lesser known culprits, or maybe some culprits that people aren't talking about in the non-functional / integrative medical world, and that would be viral exposure, lack of sleep, because we are a society of overachievers. The less we sleep, we get patted on the back and said, congratulations to. We have a lot of gut flora imbalance. And then the last one, and I think that this is a big one, are obesogens. And obesogens are toxins that can lead to obesity. And I don't care how clean we are, but we are all exposed to so many toxins. There's 84,000 chemicals introduced into the atmosphere every year. 3% are known carcinogens. Well, 3% of 84,000 is a large number. Plus, when they test toxicity, they only test one chemical or toxin at a time. And how about the synergistic effect of all those toxins that we're coming in contact with? So, Dr. Lustig, he is pretty big in the obesity world, and you can see he's a professor of clinical pediatrics at the University of California. He's found that even lab animals, people's house pets, and city rats are experiencing increases in body weight. And so we can't necessarily blame diet and exercise on those mammals, and we have to assume that it has to be something to do with toxins. So of course, I know you all know, eat organic, clean your house with non-chemical things, and all of the things that we can do our best to try to prevent exposure to as much chemical toxicity as possible. And this is just, again, explaining what an obesegen is and where they're found. So what happens is we become really good at storing fat when we're extremely toxic because we hold toxins in our fat cells. It's a body's protective measure. And then it actually alters our metabolism because it reduces the amount of calories that we can burn at rest, and again promotes the storage of calories as fat. But also something very interesting is that toxicity can actually alter the way we our hormones that regulate hunger and fullness. So definitely something to take into consideration when working with clients as to their toxic exposure. The good news is that intermittent fasting will help in all of those areas. So I just thought this little guy was cute and put him in there for a kind of chuckle, because I see about 30 patients a week in my office, and every single one of them says, well, I can't do this or I can't do that. And, I have to have breakfast or I have to have snacks. I get too hungry. I don't know that we're even aware of what true hunger feels like in this country. So something to consider. We know that a lot of people try diets, and pretty much anybody can go on a diet and lose weight. And of course, the biggest part of that is maintaining it. So the diet works for a short time, but it is not necessarily a lifestyle or lifetime change that helps keep the weight off. And I had to put this slide in there because it goes back to almost, everybody's talking about paleo today. And I think if we looked at a true Paleolithic diet compared to what people are interpreting it to be today, we didn't eat meat or protein at every single solitary meal. We ate meat when we made a kill. We basically foraged from the land. We ate plant foods. We had limited access to food. There were, of course, no grocery stores, no refrigeration. Our bodies actually evolved to exist without food, and that fasting is really more natural than eating every 3 to 4 hours. And all of this unlimited access to food has caused our bodies to be really good to become sugar burners. And so the process of eating, but it takes approximately 12 to 14 hours for the liver to be depleted of glycogen, the storage form of glucose. And the dietary recommendations that have been around for such a long time were eat 5 to 6 times a day. You never give your body a chance to regulate. Your blood sugar goes up, your insulin raises in response to elevated blood sugar, and then boom, before you're even done digesting, you're eating again. So it becomes a big problem. Plus, of course, the food pyramid prior to 2015, on the bottom of the pyramid was eat 6 to 8 servings of grains and cereals a day. And we all know that starches in grain and bread and pasta forms cause a higher glycemic response, hence a higher insulin response. And then we cannot forget about the environmental triggers we all face today. And so there's my little guys down at the bottom telling us, go back, we messed up everything. And our current day man with his oversized belly and soda in his hand. So what actually happens in the body when we eat? 20 to 45 minutes after eating, blood sugar levels rise, and then insulin is secreted in response to elevated blood sugar. Insulin forces glucose into the cells. It kind of is the limousine driver of glucose. And the glucose rise and insulin secretion, as we said before, are dependent on the foods that we've eaten. But the thing that's really important to remember is that insulin stops the use of fat as an energy source, and insulin turns off our fat burning possibility and turns on our fat storage mechanism. And insulin can also cause a loss of lean muscle. So this is something that I think needs to be taken into consideration, because so many people, especially having been a full-time personal trainer, they would work out, kill themselves in the gym, and nothing really changed in their bodies. You know, maybe they left the gym and went and had a Dunkin' Donuts, or they were just eating, you know, a big entire bowl of brown rice with a who knows what else, and so the muscle wasn't able to build, and there was actually the possibility of muscle loss. And insulin will often overcorrect blood sugar levels, and which leaves us hungry and feeling the need for more fuel. So what is intermittent fasting? Finally, we get to what this is all about. And it is not a diet. Please know that. It is an eating pattern that cycles between periods of fasting and eating. And again, I like to think of it as the vacation from work. No specific limit on food categories or calories, only when eating occurs. And the side note to that is, I think what we eat still matters. So here are some of the programs that are really popular today, the 16-8 method, and that is the program where you pick a designated 8-hour period, let's say noon to 8 p.m. And then once 8 p.m. rolls around, the kitchen's closed, the mouth is closed, and there's nothing aside from good hydration or black coffee or tea, nothing with a calorie, going into the mouth until 12 o'clock the next day. The good news is a lot of the fasting time hopefully is spent sleeping, so people are not really suffering too much. This is the method that I do. I have been doing it for 4 years. I will tell you the first 3 days were pretty miserable. And around 11 o'clock, I was the true definition of hangry. But it was almost as if an epiphany happened on day 4. And usually what I'll do is try something for 2 weeks before I put anybody on it, so that I have some idea of what they're going to experience. And at the end of 2 weeks, I said, you know what, I feel too good and I'm not going back. And here I am 4 years later. But of course, I still pay very close attention to nutritious, wholesome foods. So this next one, Eat, Stop, Eat, involves fasting for 24 hours once or twice a week. And I find that this is very difficult to ask people to do. Not eating for 24 hours and just drinking water, and you're not supposed to have coffee on an Eat, Stop, Eat plan. So it's literally drinking water for 24 hours once or twice a week. And I think that that is a very difficult program to do. And the next one, the 5-2, 2 non-consecutive days of the week, we eat only 500 to 600 calories, eat normally the other 5 days. What I found the problem to be with this one is that people underestimate the amount of calories that they're eating. And, 500 calories is not a lot of calories. So people tend to underestimate how many calories they're eating on their 2 days that they're doing the 5-2 plan. And then normally the other 5 days, you can't binge and expect the fasting to completely undo all the ill effects of binging, because the body can't handle the glucose and insulin surge from binging. So when I tell people eat normally, you need to know what your client's normal looks like before you would put them on something like that. And again, reinforcing that we should always eat nutrient-dense food. Some other additional programs that are out there: the warrior diet, fruits and vegetables during the day, and then a well-rounded larger meal in the evening, possibly containing protein or grain. Fasting mimicking diet. This is a proprietary program developed by Walter Longo. He is the head of the Longevity Center in University of Southern Cal. And interestingly enough, was just given a $10 million grant by the government to continue his work because the research he's done is so impressive. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in it, to just Google Walter, V-A-L-T-E-R, Longo, L-O-N-G-O. He spent his entire life and PhD career dedicated to fasting and the positive effects it has on the body. So, and then there's the religious fast, the Daniel fast. And there are some people that do that every year on a regular basis during a certain period of time for 21 days. And we give up an awful lot of things that we know to be inflammatory and eat mostly plant food. So we've been told if we don't eat, our metabolism is going to slow down, and that is actually a myth. And we're going to get to a slide that talks about starvation mode and slowing down metabolism. But during short-term fasting or starvation, resting energy expenditure is actually increased because fasting creates a sort of stress in the body, but it's a good stress. So, and we'll get more into that. What fasting allows us to do is mobilize fatty acids for energy, and they usually are in the form of ketone bodies. So that ketones are made in the liver, and they actually bypass digestion and are available for energy usage, because the two forms, of course, of energy for the body are carbohydrates and fat. And the body actually likes fat better as a fuel source and burns longer than the carbohydrate source of energy. We deplete our glycogen stores, which in turn will turn on the fatty acid mobilization for energy. And gluconeogenesis, of course, is essential for providing glucose to the brain. And the brain doesn't easily utilize ketone bodies. But interestingly enough, protein, in the absence of carbohydrates, will actually fuel the body through the process of gluconeogenesis. So this is where fasting becomes a problem, and it would be 72 hours or more. And that is where you will see a metabolic slowdown. It will impede weight loss. And you can see here the research shows that glucose production rate declined by 38% and resting metabolic rate decreased by 8%. And the thing that we're trying to do for people who need to lose weight or just general health is increase their metabolic rate. And then the plasma concentrations of insulin and T3 were reduced by fasting, whereas glucagon concentrations were increased after 72 hours of fasting. So it's definitely not something we want to recommend. What you eat still matters, because when you're eating less, we have to ensure that we're eating nutrient-dense food so we avoid malnutrition. I mentioned a little bit about binging. The surge that it creates, the body is just not able to handle. And so we get this huge amount of insulin. The cells can't use all the glucose that's floating around in the bloodstream, and receptor shutdown, cell receptor shutdown, and everything else gets stored as fat. We need to include healthy fats in a fasting diet because it will help increase our fat utilization, but it also is because of the increased fat utilization that happens. And when we eat high carbohydrate, it definitely turns on the enzymes that promote fat storage. We want to try to keep protein intake to 0.5 grams per pound of lean body mass or 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. You can go up to about 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And if you're working with somebody who's an athlete and extremely lean, up to about 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is recommended. But for the average person, a 0.8 grams per kilogram is what's recommended. And we use BIA testing, bioimpedance analysis, in our office. And so I get a fat measurement, a lean body mass measurement, and a basal metabolic rate. So I strongly encourage you, when you're all in practice, that you find some way to determine a person's basal metabolic rate and what their fat mass and fat-free mass is. So these are the benefits of intermittent fasting. We see it has a huge effect on the brain, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But one of the things that's important to remember is it increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that actually increases neuron development and new neurons being formed. So real important, especially in this age of increasing Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. As far as metabolism goes, we see better insulin sensitivity, better IGF-1 levels. There's a big correlation between IGF-1, elevated IGF-1, and cancer. IGF-1 is supposed to be high when we're young because it's a growth hormone, insulin growth-like factor 1, if anybody doesn't know what it is. And then we watch it decline as people get older. And when we're overfeeding, we tend to see really high IGF-1 in people who have excess body fat. As far as the cardiovascular system goes, this was really fascinating. But when we're in parasympathetic mode, of course, we're in rest and digest mode. And so we see a reduction in heart rate and heart rate variability, reduced blood pressure, and an increase in stress resistance. And then we talked about this, but decreased insulin, increased ketone production, adiponectin, and ghrelin. And then you can see reduced energy uptake, reduced inflammation, reduced cell proliferation, and a lot of the things kind of repeat category to category because the body is a whole being. We actually reset our metabolism. We become fat burners instead of sugar burners as a benefit from intermittent fasting. We optimize our insulin sensitivity, and interestingly enough, the mitochondria get stronger and they burn fuel more efficiently. As we get old, the ability to burn or utilize energy is depleted. Mitochondria don't function as well as a younger mitochondria might. And so one of the things that intermittent fasting, the research has shown, is that we can reverse mitochondrial ill health, which is why it's been also touted as one of the greatest anti-agers that we know of. And then just to recap, it involves cutting calories in whole or in part, either a couple of days a week, every other day, or daily. It's one of the most effective interventions for normalizing weight. And one of the things that has been proven in the research is that the 16-8 method is probably the most effective. The maximum amount, and this might be something you want to remember, the maximum amount during the daily intermittent fasting is a fast of 18 hours with a feeding time of 6 hours. And the minimum is 14-hour fast with a 10-hour feeding window. And I would tell you that with most people, I will start them at the 14-10 regimen so that they have a chance to get used to it. Because for a lot of people, postponing breakfast, like if they eat dinner at 7, just postponing breakfast till 9 a.m. is really no big deal. But the beneficial changes in that 14-hour fast are amazing. And so they start to feel better, they get less hungry, and we'll find out why in a few slides. And so then it's easy to move them up the scale. So 18.6 to 14.10, that's sort of the parameters that we work in. And it can be any combination of that, 17.7, 16.8, 15.9, 14.10. The health benefits are cardiovascular health, reduced cancer risk, genetic repair, gene repair, increased longevity, and dementia prevention. And we're going to go through those a little bit in more detail. So if you have learned about autophagy, autophagy is when cells clean themselves. And it's very important for good health that the process of autophagy happen on a regular basis. And just like we clean our air filter, just like we clean our vacuum cleaner bag, we need to clean our cells because we have approximately 10 trillion cells in the body. Every one of them is a combustion engine. Wherever there's energy production, there's always waste production. And we know the body makes a tremendous amount of endogenous waste. And so we want to have ways to clean that waste out of the body. The other thing that they have found is that cells repair more efficiently. One of the hallmarks of cancer is that cells don't repair and they don't listen to normal cell signaling. And one of the things that intermittent fasting does is help a cell revert back to its healthy self and listen to normal cell signals. And because of the stress induced during fasting, it's called an adaptive stress response, our cells actually switch to an anti-aging mode so that they don't work quite as hard, but they work more efficiently. Another thing that's important is human growth hormone rises, and in order to maintain muscle mass, and again, with the aging population, this is a big problem of muscle wasting. Everything we can do to increase or maintain our human growth hormone levels will help us to maintain muscle mass. We've talked about this a lot already. It modifies our insulin levels, which helps the insulin feedback loop regulate itself. So what does that mean? We become more efficient at utilizing the food we are consuming without the requirement of a huge insulin response. And so the body does really well. And for those of you that may or may not know how sort of this works, and when you do lab testing, of course, you'll figure this out. But my insulin level is 3, and let's say my patient's insulin level is 15. And we sit down to eat the same meal, calorie for calorie, bite for bite. That person is going to store that meal 5 times faster as fat than I will because of the elevated insulin level in the blood. So I think that this is, even though I've said it a lot, I think it's important, and we need to really keep that at the forefront when we're talking about intermittent fasting. We reduce oxidative stress, and we have the ability to reduce inflammation, because as important as eating is an inflammatory process for the body. And because we've got to digest it, and then we've got to get rid of the waste from it. And so we want to do everything we can to reduce inflammation, because we know inflammation is at the heart of most diseases. So this was an interesting research article from 2016, and the topic obviously was women's health. So it is considered the missing link to enhance women's health. It improves reproductive and mental health. It prevents and ameliorates cancer and musculoskeletal disorders. It improves parathyroid hormone secretion, thus improving bone health. It greatly lessens the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis by reducing inflammatory cytokines, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes. And autoimmunity, unfortunately, the female population is so much more prone to autoimmune conditions than the male population. So I think this is an important thing to remember. It can help reduce food intolerances and leaky gut, basically, and it's cardioprotective simply by virtue of the fact that the less fat we have and the lower our blood pressure and the better our lipid profile and the more normal our heart can be, we are protecting our heart from all avenues that affect heart health. Now, there's some research that's come out lately, which is not in the slides. Something you want to pay attention to, if you have, and I know some of you may have just done the HPA testing with Paula and school. If somebody is terribly stressed and their circadian rhythms are off, they're not sleeping, they're unable to basically cope, because of the stress that intermittent fasting has on the body, I would recommend, and what the research shows, is that we correct and regulate the circadian rhythms before we start a very difficult intermittent fasting or daily intermittent fasting protocol. So what I will do in this situation is I will have somebody intermittent fast maximum of 3 days a week, usually 2. And this just kind of gets them in the groove. And some of the research says that intermittent fasting will actually help regulate circadian rhythm if the person is consistent, because the body learns when to expect nourishment. And so, but if somebody is not sleeping, this is going to become a big problem for them. So just pay attention to the patient as a whole, client as a whole. Hopefully I will be able to get some updates for everybody on the intermittent fasting and circadian rhythm process. So just a side note for now. So intermittent fasting and vascular health and obesity. People that are obese have terrible vasculature. They have poor blood flow. You'll usually see them with, the blue and red leg bottoms and swollen legs. So this was a study that was done comparing a high protein intermittent fasting low calorie plan compared to the heart healthy diet. And of course, both plans showed improvement in body weight, BMI, blood lipids, and arterial function. And intermittent fasting was as effective as continuous energy restriction, which is hard for people to do, continuous calorie restriction. But the big difference was that the benefits of intermittent fasting actually lasted longer than the heart healthy diet, and arterial function continued to show improvement in the IF participants. So I think that that's important to note. So intermittent fasting and cancer, this is a pretty amazing study, and having lived in an integrative cancer office for 4 years, it really was right there in front of my face. So you can see that the quote, calorie restriction is arguably the most potent broadly acting dietary regimen for suppressing the carcinogenesis process. And many of the key studies in this field have been published in the journal Carcinogenesis. When calories are abundant, glycolytic cells have an advantage, and most cancer cells are glycolytic, meaning they feed on sugar. Because cancer cells have an impaired mitochondrial function and membrane potential, they cannot use really anything but glucose, and they need an increase in glucose because they're not as effective as making as much ATP as a normal cell is. So what the intermittent fasting does will basically starve the cancer cells of their fuel source. It also has been shown to protect normal cells from the effects of chemotherapy if somebody is getting chemo. And it takes advantage of the cancer cells' inability to survive in altered glucose situations, mainly meaning in reduced glucose situations. So cycles of starvation were also proven to be as effective as chemo in cancer progression. It also increased the effectiveness of drugs in the melanoma, glioblastomas, and breast cancer. And it also showed an increase in apoptosis, or cell death, of the cancer cells. So I think it's an important thing. We used it in our clinic all the time, and it was a very effective method for prolonging and improving cancer outcome. So we talked about this a little bit. Human growth hormone, they increase as much as 5-fold during fasting, which means somebody will actually have the greater ability to build muscle. And it stimulates collagen synthesis in skeletal muscle and tendons. And of course, we know collagen holds everything together. And having elevated human growth hormone levels will increase our fat burning, or lipolysis. So the benefits, of course, are fat loss and muscle gain. And it's a pretty amazing process. We see an increase in metabolic rate, which is great. We burn more calories even at rest, and we are more efficient at using the calories that we are consuming. So you can see here that the research showed that anywhere from 3.6 to 14% increase in metabolic rate, which is huge. Over 3 to 24 weeks, we saw a weight loss of 3 to 8% in most of the subjects, and 4 to 7% of the population lost inches in their waist. And of course, we know that central adiposity is a big problem and speaks to cardiovascular, liver, gallbladder, metabolic syndrome type diseases. And very interesting. This fascinated me. We've been told, of course, we have to eat breakfast, we have to break fast, but ghrelin, which is our hunger hormone, is actually lowest at 9 o'clock in the morning based on a normal or average circadian rhythm. And I think that this just reinforces that breakfast is not necessarily the most important meal of the day. Ghrelin also becomes and stays stable during fasting, so we have less hunger and more feelings of fullness, which is a pretty good thing. And when we have high levels of ghrelin, it can cause weight gain, and it makes weight loss very difficult because, of course, it's stimulating hunger, which, of course, stimulates increased food intake. But high ghrelin levels favors the accumulation of central adiposity, belly fat, and it promotes a lot of fat storage near the liver. And there's an estimate going around that 33% of the population is walking around with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this is a big problem. Detoxification pathways are impaired, and we know without our liver, things aren't working. Nothing is going to work. And when we have fatty liver, it also can increase the risk for developing insulin resistance, which is the pre-diabetic state. Leptin is a hormone produced by fat cells, and it is the satiety hormone. But what you need to understand here, because I think the initial knee-jerk reaction is, well, if we have more fat, we'll be fuller. But we actually become leptin resistant when we have too many fat cells and too much leptin. Leptin can't work the same way insulin can't work in an insulin resistant person. So the intermittent fasting will regulate ghrelin and leptin, and it actually makes the people more receptive and responsive to the actions of leptin, and so they feel full and satiated. I think that everything we can do to help a person who is struggling to lose weight, to decrease their hunger, is a step in the right direction. So I love this quote from Dr. Lustig: "In leptin's resistance, your leptin is high, which means you're fat, but your brain can't see it. In other words, your brain is starved while your body is obese." And that's what obesity is. It's brain starvation. Not only is leptin part of the hunger system, but it's also part of the reward system. So again, intermittent fasting helps to regulate ghrelin and leptin levels. Less fat-free mass is lost during intermittent fasting, and of course it may have a lot to do with the increase in the human growth hormone, because that will allow for lean tissue preservation. And but one of the things, and I think that this was a really neat study that they did, regular dieting versus intermittent fasting, more lean tissue was preserved during intermittent fasting than regular dieting. And so, of course, we always want a good lean body mass to fat mass ratio. Neuroprotective, it challenges the brain by activating an adaptive stress response. It increases the production of new nerve cells from stem cells in the hippocampus. Ketones are produced and suppress seizures as well as other brain disorders. Some of you familiar with a ketogenic diet know that it started to treat epilepsy back in the 1920s. I mentioned this before. We see an increase in neurotrophic factor, and this increases the number of mitochondria in the neurons, so they perform better. And it's been shown to actually ward off neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Increase in longevity. Intermittent fasting on gene expression. The changes that are seen in genetic expression are amazing, and it actually forces the genes to protect us against disease, rather than turning on the genes that we may have inherited that are disease promoting genes. So it induces oxidative stress and a surge in free radicals. But what happens is the increase in oxidative stress stimulates sirtuins, which is the SIRT3 gene, which is and gives us an increased production of sirtuins, which are protective proteins that are associated with longevity. And also the increase in the SIRT3 is involved in protective cell responses. So it has been shown, and that is what Dr. Longo has been studying for years, is the fasting benefits on anti-aging and longevity. So we talked about this a little bit, just touching on it, but basic cell biology is that the cell's ability to process energy over time decreases, and this leads to a lot of rapid aging and age-related diseases. The mitochondria exist in a network that change shape based on energy demand, and fused mitochondrial networks are considered youthful, and fasting actually improves and promotes youthful networks or fused networks. And what we saw in the research was that when calories were abundant and people were severely overweight or just somewhat overweight or bad body composition, that their networks were not fused or not quite as youthful. And the youthful networks also help increase lifespan, which modulate fat metabolism. So we become much better at using fat for fuel and metabolizing fat over time with intermittent fasting. This is probably the single most important benefit of intermittent fasting, and that is the cellular repair process that it happens because of autophagy, where cells digest and remove old and dysfunctional proteins that build up inside the cells. So, like I said, we need to clean our air conditioning filters. We need to clean our bodies. And you can see that autophagy is important for balancing sources of energy at critical times in development and in response to nutrient stress. It is basically the housekeeping role that will clean the cells, but most importantly, which is highlighted, it eliminates intracellular pathogens. And of course, this can be bacterial pathogens, viral pathogens, or unfortunately, cancer pathogens. So very, very, very important part of intermittent fasting. And I've given you a few slides here on the process of autophagy. So these are some of the things that induce autophagy: fasting, exercise, and coffee and tea. Very interesting. And then these are some supplements that are shown to induce autophagy: hydroxycitrate, nicotinamide, resveratrol, and EGCG. So they basically work as calorie restriction mimetics, and that's not necessarily a bad thing and can be used in conjunction with an intermittent fasting protocol. And then here are some of the inhibitors of autophagy. Vitamin C and E, partially because of their high antioxidant properties, because remember, the body we need antioxidants because of all the free radical exposure and production in the body, but we don't want to overdo the antioxidants to prevent the cells from cleaning themselves. And interestingly, that vitamin C and E can diminish the health benefits of exercise. Exercise creates stress, promotes autophagy, and vitamin C and E can diminish it. Not saying not to use it, not saying not to take it, just know and be aware of the dosing and that it can inhibit autophagy. So as you can see at the bottom, many of the benefits of calorie restriction come from the stress response of the organism, specifically the response to free radicals or reactive oxygen species, and vitamin C and E blunt this response. So here's your labs that really are the ones to watch. Triglycerides, you should see a big decrease in triglycerides, of course, a decrease in insulin, an increase in human growth hormone, an increase in testosterone, a lowering of hemoglobin A1C, and a reduction in high sensitivity C-reactive protein, because as inflammation is reduced, CRP should also reduce. And then just the visual stuff and the monitoring stuff, if you don't have access to labs: weight loss, blood pressure, and waist circumference. I do measurements on all of my clients and take their weight every time they come in and their blood pressure. So pretty effective stuff. So this is just a recap, and this quote was written by Dr. Longo. Thus, fasting has the potential to delay aging and help prevent and treat diseases while minimizing the side effects caused by chronic dietary interventions. And we've discussed this, but just to recap, in animal and human studies, intermittent or periodic fasting is protective against diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and neurodegeneration. And it's also in humans shown to reduce obesity, hypertension, asthma, and rheumatoid arthritis. So these are some of the patients that we want to use caution with. And again, caution could be, one, not doing it at all. Caution could be only implementing an intermittent fasting protocol 1, 2, or 3 days a week. or just a very reduced amount of time. And the reason for the 14-10 being the minimum is the depletion of glycogen from the liver takes anywhere from 12 to 14 hours. So that would be the benefit, is that glycogen would be depleted and then we would refuel the body. But your hypoglycemics, I would strongly encourage you to get their blood sugar balanced before you start a fasting protocol, although fasting can help regulate blood sugar. So again, a light fasting protocol. A brittle diabetic, that is somebody whose blood sugar is uncontrolled, even with medication. Although I will tell you right now, I have a client who is a brittle diabetic, and all the doctors keep doing is increasing her metformin and her insulin and whatever other drug that she's on. And we started an intermittent fasting protocol. And from May, I just got her blood work, from May 16th to July 5th or 6th. We saw a decrease in blood sugar from 323 glucose to 127. Her A1C went from 13.6 to 7.7. The doctor has cut her medication in half, and she's lost in 2 months approximately 17 pounds. So I'm not quite as cautious as I used to be using it with brittle diabetics. Women trying to conceive, obviously they need a lot of nutrients because we need good hormone production. Pregnant and or breastfeeding, and that would be, of course, because the increased need of the fetus or the baby who's breastfeeding. Severely low blood pressure, because it does lower your blood pressure. People taking medications. The big one to watch is thyroid medication. A lot of people that are on thyroid medication are very sensitive to intermittent fasting times. So again, individuality, client by client, and see where it goes. Underweight patients, we don't need them to lose any more weight. And it's kind of hard to tell somebody, eat whatever you want, but only eat it in these hours, because our goal as holistic nutritionists is to provide them with the most nutrient-dense diet. Somebody with a history of eating disorders, and somebody that has a history of amenorrhea or absence of period. So now to get to how we do it. The recommended intermittent fasting plan has shown to be the 16-8. So the example would be start eating at 12 or 1, complete feeding by 7 or 8, nothing with a calorie until 1 or 12 or 1 o'clock, coffee, tea, calorie-free drinks, not sweetened with artificial sweeteners. That's an important part. Encourage eating whole foods, focus on high quality protein. We talked about the protein calculation, and that they drink half their body weight in ounces of water. So here's a typical day in intermittent fasting. This is the protocol that I follow. I find it incredibly easy. And I work out in the morning before I go to work, and just make sure I'm really well hydrated. The suggested daily food plan, and this is, if you'll note up top, it says therapeutic for weight loss, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome or syndrome X. 3 to 4 servings per day of lean protein. The dairy is very specific. The reason these dairies are used is because they're higher protein and higher sulfur dairy. If there's no sensitivity or allergy detected, non-starchy vegetables, at least 2.5 cups a day. And then legumes, 1 serving per day. And this is a 1/2 cup of cooked beans, peas or lentils, 1/4 cup of hummus. Nuts and seeds, 1 serving per day. Fats, 6 servings per day. And then you can optionally use a therapeutic protein, like with my diabetic patient right now, I have her on ultra glucose control from Metagenics. So, and she does that before she eats her lunch, 1 scoop, and then she does her meal, and then she has a mid-afternoon light meal or snack, and then she does 1 scoop of ultra glucose control right before her evening meal. And obviously, from what I told you, it's working beautifully. So this was a really interesting case study. Male, 41 years old, diagnosed with, you can see all of the conditions. His goals were weight loss, blood pressure regulation, increase in energy, increase in libido, and correct his metabolic syndrome. And he does participate, in spite of his excess weight, in strenuous cardio and weight exercises, Orange Theory to be specific. And here's a chart. He came in at 269.6. We started intermittent fasting right around February. He was up to 274 by the time he came back in. This is when I was with the doctor, so he came in actually to see the doctor because he needed to be on meds because it was such an acute situation. And then we started intermittent fasting in the beginning of March, end of February. By March 24th, down to 251, and by July 20th, down to 224. You can see the reduction in blood pressure from 158 over 110 to 121 over 76. His O2 sat was good because of all the exercise, but it held at 99% after a certain amount of time. His resting heart rate dropped 2 beats, and his pulse was really impressive, from 90 down to 64. So he's feeling good, looking good, and all is right with the world. On this one, look at the decrease in the triglycerides and the insulin and his CRP. We went from 356 down to 100 in triglycerides. Insulin was at 24.4, down to 10.1. CRP cut in half. A1C reduced by 0.6, and blood sugar down by 8 points consistently. So some additional lifestyle recommendations that I will make is manage stress. However the patient is able to do it. You don't need to go to yoga or meditation to breathe. So you can breathe all the time and practice good breathing techniques. Sleeping, consider proper supplementation, making recommendations if comfortable, or sending to a local nutrition professional. Probiotic, the strain L. rhamnosus has been linked to improved body composition and weight loss, so you may want to find a probiotic that includes the Lactobacillus rhamnosus in it. And exercise, HIIT is definitely recommended, high intensity interval training, but anything you can do to get people moving will be beneficial. And that pretty much concludes the slides. Fasting is at the foundation of the body's ability to protect, repair, and rejuvenate itself. And said by Dr. Longo, my hero. So.
Thank you, Georgette. Really appreciate this comprehensive review of intermittent fasting, and the case study was so helpful to include to see how it affected that individual over time, particularly.
Yes.
So thank you for including that.
Mm-hmm.
We have some good questions if you're ready.
I'm ready.
All right. So back to coffee.
Okay.
Many patients start the day with coffee, and so
Yes.
if they don't eat breakfast until 14 plus hours after their last meal, does the coffee interfere with the fast in any way?
If it's black coffee, no.
Mm-hmm.
If they're putting in milk or cream or sweetener, yes. But there is just one coffee that doesn't really interfere with fasting, and that would be the bulletproof coffee, recipe. If you're not familiar, it's 8 ounces of brewed coffee, 1 tablespoon of coconut oil, 1 tablespoon of ghee or grass-fed organic butter, and then frothed. It will not, and I will often start my patients on that just to get them through the morning, because it staves off hunger, it's satiating, and of course we're increasing fat intake, so it will improve with their fat burning mechanism. But black coffee absolutely does not interfere with fasting.
Okay. So with intermittent fasting, specifically the 14-10 or the 6-8 program, is it safe for children and adolescents?
No.
At what age is it safe to start then?
I would say probably anywhere from 14 to 16 years old, where maybe growth has slowed down a little bit. You can certainly expand the feeding window and allow for at least a 12-hour fast. That would be safe, because that is what should be normal anyway.
Right, thank you. You mentioned the caution caveat around vitamin C and vitamin E. So we wonder if there's a better time to take vitamin C and E.
I would say during time of feeding rather than during time of fasting, because during fasting is when autophagy is happening, and we don't necessarily want to prevent that.
Okay, and a good follow-up question then would, how much vitamin C would be acceptable then in regards to autophagy?
Yeah, so the research showed that 1 gram of vitamin C, 1,000 milligrams, can prevent autophagy. So I think this again has to be sort of individualized, but I would be comfortable using 500 to 750 milligrams.
Okay, thanks so much. Do you think, you want to go back further in the presentation, back to the 2015 dietary guidelines, and we're wondering if you think that those dietary guidelines omitted breakfast guidelines intentionally because of the obesity epidemic, or can you explain the reasoning for it?
Yeah, that actually what what the research showed when they redid the guidelines, they specifically said, they being the USDA, said there is no evidence that eating breakfast is important.
Amazing that overrode the potent lobbyists that were influencing it up until 2015. That's a powerful response from USDA.
Yes, it is definitely powerful response.
And then you discussed the self-reported obesity. I think that was in 2016.
Yes.
I think it was amazing that many people identified themselves as obese.
I was shocked at that, to be perfectly honest. It is amazing that and I think that may be part of the problem. Is it's like there's such hopelessness, like they know they're obese and they don't know what to do about it. And maybe they did it. I don't know exactly how that self-report, how the CDC and how they gathered that information, but it was, it's from the government website, and maybe they were screaming for help. Who knows?
Yes, I'm stunned too that many people would identify themselves as obese.
Yes.
But yes, it's very indicative of the epidemic and the depth of the problem and the impact that it's having on people emotionally and psychologically also.
Right.
Okay, let's, anything else you want to follow up on that?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to take us back then to the Obesegen toxins that lead to obesity. And identifying a toxin as an obesegen, are you identifying all toxins as obesogens?
Pretty much, because toxins disrupt disrupt the endocrine system. They disrupt the neuroendocrine system. They accumulate in fat cells. They affect detoxification pathways, and every cell has its own detoxification pathway, as well as the liver having a detoxification pathway, kidneys, skin, breath, etc. And so I don't know that we can pick and choose which
I was just
toxin.
wondering if we needed to try to identify an obesogene versus a different kind of a toxin.
Well, right now what they're saying is that pretty much all chemicals can fall into the obesogene category. I mean, there are some big ones that we know, like BPA and things like that, but I think it's pretty, I mean, we're not supposed to have this kind of exposure to chemicals, and it's causing major problems. So Paula, the thing that fascinated me in the cancer clinic, we had an extremely high rate of non-smoking lung cancer. And where does that come from? Particulates in the air, off-gassing from furniture and paint and buildings and mold and things like that. It was just unprecedented how many people that don't smoke have lung cancer.
And it's one of the highest rates of increase that we're seeing too.
Yes.
Okay, there's a question that has us circling back to intermittent fasting for diabetics who are not brittle diabetics. Would you work with somebody on an individual basis, or would you say that intermittent fasting is somewhat safe for a diabetic? And if so, which of the plans would you pick for it?
I can confidently, having worked with lots of diabetics, say that intermittent fasting is completely safe. And I would probably start them off 14-10, do that for about 2 weeks, and then maybe go to 15-9 for another 2 weeks, and then hold them at the 16-8, which is what I generally do.
All right, good, thank you. And circling back then to the 5-2 diet, to eat only 500 to 600 calories a day, we're wondering if that is without the hourly restriction, or they can just eat that many calories in a day without limiting the time that they're eating it.
No hourly restriction at all on the 2 days of the 500 to 600 calories.
And with intermittent fasting and with a 5-2 diet like that, is so they can eat all day. There's no feeding times. You're not trying to have them have meals, or they just eat anytime.
They can eat. I mean, what the plan is that they just eat. On the 5 days they eat normally. I would personally encourage somebody not to. What I'll do is what they call time restricted eating. So what I try to get my patients to do that won't do intermittent fasting, and I think that this could be done very easily with a 5-2 plan on the 5 days of normal eating, is allow 4 to 5 hours between each meal. So encourage breakfast, 4 to 5 hours of fasting, encourage lunch, and then 4 to 5 hours of fasting, encourage dinner, and then mouth closed, kitchen closed. And then on the 2 days of restricting calories, that really, I mean, you're eating so little, even if you sat down and ate all 500 calories for dinner, it's still probably less than what most people eat for dinner in calories. So.
Okay. Well, coffee. People love their coffee. There's coffee questions coming in more. So.
I'm right there with them.
Can coffee in the morning raise cortisol and therefore insulin for some people?
Yes, of course it can. We know coffee can be an adrenal stimulator. But what the research showed is that because there's no calories accompanying it,
Mhm.
the body does a much better job managing the cortisol insulin response than if there were calories included with the coffee,
Wow.
which is kind of interesting.
It is. I'm twisting my brain around that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Back to another wow factor for obesity is brain starvation. So I'm just translating that to the levels of dementia and Alzheimer's that we're seeing and the increase in that. Increase in obesity, increase in dementia, Alzheimer's.
Yes. Well, you know, we know the famous saying, we're overfed but undernourished.
Yes.
And one of the things with obesity is it is usually a high glycemic diet.
Mhm.
And so there's no nutrients being consumed. The body is using nutrients to combat the poor nutrient consumption and the bad food, you know, in quotations, bad food consumption. And so the brain doesn't, it may get its glucose, but let's not forget that the brain needs lots of nutrients to function properly. You know, phosphatidylserine, phosphatidylcholine. I mean, it just it goes on and on and on and on and on. And so the brain is basically overfed but undernourished. And considering, you know, there's a condition called hidden hunger, and I think it
Yes.
speaks to overfed, undernourished, where we're eating, but where still our body is hungry because we're starving for nutrients. And Dr. Bredesen has attributed one of the types of Alzheimer's to, I guess they've called it diabetes of the brain. And usually those people are also overweight and have all kinds of other blood sugar dysregulation problems and or bad lipid profile, et cetera, et cetera.
I look forward to some conducted studies with intermittent fasting with people with dementia and Alzheimer's. I would think that would have to be in a controlled environment because in many cases they lose their sensation of their sense of appetite anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to see some follow-up on that moving forward.
Yeah, Dr. Bredesen's a big fan of intermittent fasting with a keto-like diet. I know you've read Bredesen's work, but for the rest of the people on the call, he is, the book is The End of Alzheimer's, and I did a 4-day training with him down here in South Florida, and he said he's a huge fan of intermittent fasting because of the adaptive stress response, because of the lowering of blood sugar and insulin. But of course, there has to be either good caregiving. You know, you can't necessarily expect a person who doesn't know who they are or who anybody else is to manage that on their own. So I agree, it would have to be a controlled environment.
Thank you. We just have a couple more questions. What about what impact does the keto diet or intermittent fasting have on athletic endurance performance? Since
Oh,
carbs are the preferred source of energy, so we're told.
right. Well, first of all, let's not forget the body. You know, if you look at food from a calorie perspective, and a calorie is nothing more than a unit of energy, protein and carbohydrates provide 4 calories per gram, and fat provides 9 calories per gram. So it's more than double the amount of energy provided from a gram of fat. The nice thing of intermittent fasting is you can really take any dietary protocol you want, whether it be paleo, vegan, pagan, pescatarian, keto, and implement it into intermittent fasting. And because of the rise in human growth hormone, their musculature becomes so much stronger that there is no effect on athletic ability. And there's a great book, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance by Jeff Volek. And it's not necessarily fasting, but it is definitely more keto based than fasting based.
Mhm.
But it's amazing. As I said, I work out in the morning, and I do a pretty strenuous workout, and I have had absolutely zero trouble building muscle, losing body fat, maintaining my muscle, and my strength is better.
Excellent. Well, given that you did your thesis on the ketogenic diet in relation to cancer when you were as you graduated from Hawthorn University, and you've done so much research on it moving forward, I'd like to have you back and have a presentation on the ketogenic diet coming up, okay?
It would be my pleasure.
All right. I'd like to end with this question. Back to the intermittent fasting and women's health slide that you had. I think the benefits must also depend almost entirely on what foods are being consumed. Would
Oh,
you
that was the
comment on
theme.
that?
Yes, that was a theme basically from the get-go, that what we eat still matters. And you can't leave the gym and be during your fast and then go to Dunkin' Donuts with two custard filled whatever Boston cream donuts and a whatever drink the freeze thing,
Yes, yes.
and expect benefits. But and this is what's really nice about intermittent fasting is if a person has I don't like to call it cheat, I like to call it treat. If a person has a treat day, if they can maintain their intermittent fasting protocol, regimen, hours, their body will respond very favorably to the treat, and it will not have the impact that it had prior to intermittent fasting. I have a client who just got back from a 2-week European vacation. She walked into my office and she said, "Oh my God, I'm scared to do the BIA. I'm scared to get on the scale. Whatever." She said, "But I never broke the intermittent fasting protocol." She did not gain an ounce. Her numbers on her BIA, in other words, intracellular water, extracellular water, fat mass, and phase angle, were all exactly the same as they were prior to her 2 weeks in Europe.
Right. Thank you for that. I think that it brings us to the end of our questions and the end of the presentation. I have just a few closing comments, everybody, so appreciate you taking just a little bit more time. I want to remind you that this webinar was recorded and it'll be available up on our website under archived webinars in just a few days. As usual, there will be a survey to fill out after the webinar ends. It really helps us to have your feedback and any comments that you can offer about this presentation. I appreciate you taking the time for that. I will let you know about our next webinar is on Tuesday, August 21st with Dr. Sarika Sarenhaus. She's going to be speaking with us about bacteriophage therapy and how we can implement this potent therapy into our practices. I'm really excited to bring you this important information. Sarika is a fun presenter and the information can literally be life-changing. So there'll be more information about that coming up, but I hope you'll join us for that. And a reminder of our next All About Alumni is Wednesday, August 1st at noon Pacific time with our master's graduate, Margot Volksum. She's going to be presenting about her post-graduation activities, and this series is just so much fun and so informing and motivating. So join in for that. All right. That concludes today's presentation. I want to thank you again, Georgette, for just the terrific plethora of information you offered today.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure, and I hope everybody enjoyed it.
All right. I want to thank everybody for sharing this educational experience together. Of course, I wish you all the best of health and look forward to learning more together at Hawthorn University's webinar, our All About Alumni series. And until then, I'm going to continue to practice intermittent fasting because what we practice grows stronger, right? So if it's right for you, you can join in with me with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Try it.
All right, everybody. Thanks so very much.
Okay. Good night.
Bye for now.